Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 10th public lecture hosted by NUS Cities. Before we start the event, please ensure your devices are on silent mode or powered off. Thank you. For those who don't know about NUS Cities, we are a university-wide, multidisciplinary, open, and inclusive collaborative platform hosted within the College of Design and Engineering, otherwise known as CDE. Through our collaborations with local and international institutions, we hope to create synergies that extend within as well as beyond NUS. The NUS Cities Public Lecture Series will investigate policies, ideas, and projects developed by urban experts which aspire to create sustainable, resilient, and livable cities. Through the lecture series, we hope to create a platform for discussion, retrospection, and conversation, giving momentum to the ongoing research and exploration regarding issues concerning cities. I would now like to introduce our speaker of the evening. Tim Stonor is an architect and urban planner specializing in the analysis and design of human behavior patterns, the way in which people move, interact, and transact in buildings and urban spaces. He's recognized internationally for his work in the development of data-driven design techniques and the use in urban planning and architectural design projects, right from city master plans to individual building interiors. Mr. Stonor is the managing director of Space Syntax, an urban planning and design company. Mr. Stonor is the managing director of Space Syntax, an urban planning and design company originally created at the Bartlett University College London in 1989 with a mission to develop, apply, and disseminate a science-based and human-focused approach to architectural design. He is a founding member and former director of the Academy of Urbanism, a visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London, and a Harvard Leo Fellow. He's also a member of the advisory board of the Norman Foster Foundation and a former deputy chair and trustee at the UK Design Council, where he is now the ambassador. Please join me in welcoming him on stage.
Thank you, Sanjana, and good evening, everyone here in the room at NUS and joining online. It's a real pleasure to have had this invitation to speak to you this evening. In putting a lecture together, it's always worth remembering the title. And I want to dwell on the three words very briefly in the title: bold, compassionate, and data-driven. I hope in about 55 minutes time, I might have persuaded you that to address the sustainable future of cities, we need to be all three. We definitely need to be bold. We can use data to its best purposes, but in doing so, we need to be compassionate. And that means putting people at the heart of our practice, whether that practice is academic research or whether it's out there on the streets making change, or whether ideally it's both interconnected, seamless, fundamental discovery of new inventions in universities, right to the building of new places for people in our towns and cities. That's a little bit of my career. Thanks, Sanjana, for that introduction. I'm not an academic. I am a visiting professor at UCL, but at a relatively young age, early in my career, I made a decision that for me, I wanted to be out on the streets practicing and being as close as I could to change. So I forewent the opportunities of academia, but I know many of you in the room are still enjoying them. So it's a pleasure to be among you. Technology. Let's start with the tech. There's hardly a conversation in meetings around the world that doesn't somehow hope or expect that technology will play the part of improving our lives, improving our businesses, improving our livelihoods. But of course, technology is just technology. Tools are just tools. It's how you wield the tool, to what purpose you send the tool that really, really matters. you need principles. I've been in too many smart cities discussions where I've only heard about technology and I haven't heard about principles. So I want to try in this talk this evening to describe some of the principles behind the use of the tools that my organization, Space Syntax, has been involved in the development of, that have guided that development. Principles about human life, but also principles about spatial structuring, about land use mixing, that inform the ongoing development of those tools. Because we are in academia, I can use the word theory. I might not use the word theory in another room because people are afraid of theories. They think that they're somehow unnecessary. But I also want to talk about theories of social, physical, spatial structuring. And all of that is for the purpose of achieving goals. So I'd like us to turn next to the goals. You know, why are we all doing what we do? Why are we using the principles to direct the tools? What are our goals? Well, we can turn to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for a global common platform to address the urgent needs of the planet. You may or may not be familiar with the 17 SDGs. Number 11 is the one that pertains most directly to cities, sustainable cities and communities. It's the one that many urban practitioners cite as the SDG that is most directly at the heart or creating the context for their work. But indeed, all of these goals are related to cities. The eradication of poverty, the removal of hunger, they all relate to cities. Cities are where most people already live and where even more people are going to live in the next couple of decades. Cities are where most inventions occur. Cities are where the greatest amount of CO2 is generated, but cities are also the most efficient means of using energy. So cities are a place that, if we get them right, we can deliver these goals. If we get them wrong, it'll be because of poor urban planning and design that we will fail to achieve these important goals. Now, sticking with the United Nations, the other policy document I think that's worth referencing is the new urban agenda. Again, if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to become so. You may already, I think if we did a straw poll on this call in this room and said, give us a definition of sustainability, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it came back and said it's social, it's economic, and it's environmental, often referred to as the triple bottom line of sustainability. And yet here we are, the new urban agenda, a document whose age I forget, but let's say it's 15 years approximately. Someone can correct me or inform me otherwise. This is a document that's been around a while. It has 4 pillars. No one ever talks about the 4th, spatial sustainability. This is the UN central document on sustainability. If you dig deeper into it, spatial sustainability gets about 3 or 4 pages, but the policy writers at the time had the courage of their conviction to say, this stuff's important. And that the urban planning dimensions of spatial sustainability are important. So I was delighted when I was shown this slide to appreciate that, in fact, you don't get the social, the economic, or the environmental unless you've got the 4th pillar in place, the spatial sustainability of cities. And I'd like to really talk about where I see that in my practice and how I can share some lessons from experience of what makes sustainable cities and perhaps what doesn't. Turn a couple of pages in the new urban agenda. There's also a reference to mapping and spatial data. Again, lit up my day when I saw this, gave me great satisfaction that I was at the heart of things, using technology, using mapping. I'm going to share some of it with you. And just in case you came here for a space syntax lecture, don't worry, I'll get onto the space syntax and talk about what space syntax is and how it's applied in practice. We might even get on in discussion to what space syntax isn't. I look forward to your contributions. And then urban design is the other box that I'm going to just highlight here. How can we use mapping and spatial data in the practice of urban design to deliver that fourth pillar of spatial sustainability? I've stuck with this policy context to show you one last policy document, then we'll get the policy out of the way and we can move on to the practice. But this is the Global Urban Monitoring Framework. This is what the United Nations has been grappling with. I've highlighted my name for a bit of self-aggrandizement as a contributor to this document. And the fascinating discussions about, okay, we've got these goals, how, and we've got this sort of feeling that spatial sustainability is important and tech is important and urban design is important. How can we actually go a step further? And this document is about a method of measuring and monitoring the performance of cities, which I'll give you my own perspective on shortly. But if this doesn't give us a global, as I mentioned earlier, common platform for focusing our efforts on the urgent needs of the planet, there's nothing else that does more centrally than this. So let's just move on to a next important question. What is a city? Because these documents are suggesting that there's something physical, spatial, it's about urban design. But in fact, I just want to pause and suggest that it's the contained, not the container, that really matters. It's the people, not the place, that matters more. And so our practice, whether that's academic practice, whether it's professional practice, has to have people at the heart of it. It's kind of should be obvious. And it may just be because my training was in architecture, where it isn't obvious to most architects. It's certainly of my generation that people matter. Our training had very little to do with people. I hope yours doesn't. Our training was about how to make buildings look fantastic that then make us look fantastic. It wasn't about people. But put people at the heart of it and put the observation of people at the heart of it. Build the urban observatory to look at how people behave and do it at eye level. Don't just do it with satellites and cameras looking down. Do it at eye level. Look into people's eyes. Look at what's happening. And there are 8 things going on here, which are, a summary at best of the subtleties of human life in cities. Just the presence of people choosing to come to cities to be co-present with other people. You don't even have to communicate with those other people to feel part of a community, but you might just raise your hand, or as I did walking down the street, just nodded to say hello to someone I'd never met before, I was never going to speak to, they're never going to speak to me. But somehow there was an enrichment of the human experience simply to communicate non-verbally with a person. Verbal communications often lead to introductions. One of the most precious phenomena that happens in cities is I go to meet a friend for coffee. When they are sat with me, one of their friends walks past. They introduce me to that person. And that person may come and join us. My original friend may go off and do something else. I'm now talking to someone I've never met before. And not all the time, but sometimes that conversation might lead to an idea that neither of us have ever had before. Those interactions lead to transactions. There could be social transactions. We're getting on well. Let's meet later. Let's meet for a drink. Might be social. Might be the beginning of a relationship. You get introduced. It might be a business as well as a social relationship or social relationship. You're trying to do this, I'm trying to do that. I'm working on this chemical structure, you're working on that chemical structure. Goodness me, we're working on the same thing. And what we haven't realized is there's the extra thing that we've just invented through our discussion. These subtleties of introduction lead to processes of innovation that we can then broadcast around, whether it's writing papers or social media or whatever. These are 8 dimensions of basic, everyday, normal human experience. They weren't part of my education as an architect, but they're fundamental to whether my buildings work or not, my public spaces work or not. So I'd like us all to consider them and maybe, fill in some of the gaps and expand it further. What are the other processes that matter? But this one of transaction seems to really, really be at the heart of cities. Cities are transaction machines. We have cities, I'd like to suggest, to create the greatest opportunity for human beings to come together to transact socially, economically. That's why we have cities. We don't just have cities because they're there. We've made cities as a species. Humanity has created cities for tens of thousands of years. That must be for a reason. And I think that reason has something to do with the future, with creating networks that allow us to deal with the future. Whether that's the shocks of the future, whether it's the technological developments that are going to affect the future. Cities are laboratories in their own right that help us think about the future. They're extensions of our brains. Cities, and this is where I'm going to just reference neuroscience and reference the cognitive science that is also trying to understand how the brain works and how the neurons fire in our brain, in the gridded parts of our brains that have node cells and link cells that are frighteningly similar to concepts of spatial structuring of streets and squares. Maybe for another occasion, but I think we build cities to extend our brains and create a collective brain. And in thinking about the future, I'd like to share 6 trends, 6 things that I've seen happening that I think will distinguish those cities that achieve more sooner in terms of addressing sustainable goals. And in conversation, you might want to challenge me that maybe I've got the wrong 6. These are mine. Help me fill in the gaps and expand the list is my plea to you. So 6 trends that will affect the future. And I'm going to share a quote here. I think it might be the only quote in this lecture. You may already have seen it before from William Gibson. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I love coming to Singapore. I've been coming since I was 20 years old. And I've seen a lot of change. That was a long time ago, relatively. I've seen a lot of change. And every time I come here, I see something I've never seen before. But a year later, I've seen it in London. And I imagine if you visit London, you'll see something there that you'll see in a year's time in Singapore. So the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. The other thing I'd like to do is to just pay tribute and acknowledge that the work I'm showing you today is the work of many people. These are my current colleagues at Space Syntax in London and beyond. And there's 30 or 40 years worth of work that I'm going to share from these and other colleagues over the years. So let's get into it. Global trend number 1 is the transformation of highways into boulevards. I'm going to show 2 or 3 case studies where we're no longer building these fast roads, or we shouldn't be. We mostly aren't. There are still some parts of the world that are, but they're realizing pretty quickly it was the wrong decision. These sorts of wide boulevards are unnatural. Wide highways are unnatural. moving at high speed through a city is unnatural. Having to travel a huge distance to do anything is unnatural. If there could be an alternative much closer to home. So this was Düsseldorf in 1990, and 30 years later, this is Düsseldorf. That fast highway, built at enormous public expense, has been ripped out and replaced with a park and reconnecting the city back to the water that gave birth to the city in the first place. That's quite a large-scale example of one. Let's go to Lisbon. To many cities worldwide, they would look at this street in Lisbon in 2009 and say, well, it's actually not too bad. You can see it's got footways either side. There's just one lane of traffic in each direction. But again, to the people of Lisbon, it wasn't good enough. So here we are, 2017, a little narrowing. Let's go to Utrecht in the Netherlands. Now, this highway that you can see here, I can't even count the lanes. If someone can count the lanes, could they tell me? Thank you. I stopped at about 8, 9, multiple levels and so on. This was actually built over the canal that had previously been the trade route and the environmental lung of the city. This fast highway divided the communities that had previously existed around that canal. So what happened? They took it out and put the canal back. Huge expense. If only they could have gone back in history, maybe they might not have spent the money in the way they did at the time. My own experience of this sort of process happening in London, Trafalgar Square in 1996. One of our senior politicians, so the story goes, was almost knocked over crossing the road, which is just behind the balustrade, where between the Trafalgar Square in the foreground and the National Gallery of Art in the background. And so he launched an international competition to do something about this so that he wouldn't be knocked over again. We entered the competition with Norman Foster, the British architect, and Norman, in fact, used this image in the presentation to the jury. I guess you probably have to be someone like Norman Foster to say, I actually don't have a design. I don't know what the answer is, but we have a process. And that is, we're going to study people. And what we'd done for the competition was we'd followed 300 people walking around Trafalgar Square. So at the back is the National Gallery. There is the road in the middle. And the photograph that you saw was taken from about where the red dot is now. And 2 of the 300 people actually walked through the square. The other 250 odd walked around the outside of the square, even though it was longer. They just couldn't physically cross the road. And even if they did, I don't know if you noticed, there was a wall and there was no way of cutting across the square. And then there was this obvious moment that's only obvious once it's happened, where we were talking about the solution and said, let's put a stair in. We'd won the competition by this point. Foster had pulled the rabbit out the hat, and they believed him that he would have the answer because he had a process. And having won the commission, we settled on the staircase. And this was the CGI. This is a sort of 1997 CGI, not bad. A few kids with balloons. There's always kids with balloons. And then this is the square as built. And the transformation of that former highway has been completed with the highway turned into a pedestrianized route, and then the staircase taking people to walk and sit on those steps. Now, Trafalgar Square is a very high profile example, but I'm pleased to say at a much smaller scale, at a much more local level, and perhaps in circumstances that you might not expect in parts of the world, this change continues. We're in the Middle East in these images here, in 2nd or 3rd tier cities. These are not glamorous projects, but the national government of this country has said, we don't think it's dignified for people to be walking on streets where there's no footway, where there's no pedestrian crossing, There's no shade. I'll come on to shade later. And our role at Space Syntax in the studio that we've created to provide urban design and architectural solutions has been to propose transformations of those streets to create the sort of dignified, everyday, compassionate public realm that gives people the chance to have the transactions that I mentioned earlier really, really matter. There isn't time today to go through all the detail of the designs, but we go through to every detail of the height of the curb, the location of the pedestrian crossing, the small little measures like little car ramps that give the impression to the driver that they're going to slow down and this is a slow speed. I'm going to come on to that next environment. All the while, so if we just look on the left here, the existing situation is here, top left. This is the height of buildings existing. There is a significant density of new development proposed for this city, significant population growth, but all with a much reduced capacity for moving vehicles, because the expectation is that people will not have to move as far to go from where they live to where they work. That's one of my forthcoming trends I'll move to after we move to number 2, which is reducing speed. So as well as transforming highways into boulevards, the other trend worldwide is slowing vehicles down. Where did we get this obsession with speed? The early 20th century, the Voisin automobile in particular. How many are architects in the room? I wish I could ask you online and see the answers. There's a few architects. Go on, I'm one. It's not such a admission of guilt, because and we've got someone online as well raising their hand. Thank you. But I don't know about you, and maybe some of the younger architects weren't given the kind of addictive education that Le Corbusier is God or was God. But this is Le Corbusier's automobile. This is the Voisin automobile owned by Corb, the very one that inspired, if you know your urban planners in the room, yeah, you know the plan voisin. Now, I always thought voisin was French for neighbor. Oui, c'est ça, exactement, ouais, voisin. No, it's the Voisin Automobile Company. And guess what they did? They sponsored the demolition of Paris. They sponsored, it didn't happen. Well, it didn't happen in Paris, but they sponsored, this is the Marais, just north of the Ile de la Cité, Notre Dame, Ile Saint-Denis. They would have removed all those historic buildings that those of us who are lucky enough to visit Paris get to visit, and replaced them with fast highways and tower blocks. And Corb, Le Corbusier, in the description of the plan, said, I will live on one side of the city, my secretary will live on the other, and every day we will grind gears and consume gasoline to drive at speed to meet each other in our office in the center. Kind of paraphrasing it a little, but it's something like that. But he says grind gears and consume gasoline. I can verify those words. This is a plan absolutely dedicated to achieving a high carbon footprint at speed. It's no surprise that we are where we are with urban planning. Didn't happen in Paris, but it's happened in just about every other city on the planet. We are obsessed with speed. So Paris today, 30 kilometers an hour speed limit policy. Not just Paris, we can go to Bilbao, 30 kilometers an hour speed limit, 20 miles an hour speed limit. Crazy, impossible. It'll never happen. Well, it has, and it is. And it's happening in cities all over the world, not just on the little quiet streets, but on the main streets. Any street where people live or exist as pedestrians, there are policies to 30 kilometers an hour. And you may look at the cities you're familiar with and think impossible. but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. The World Health Organization, again, links to the UN, global policy for 30-kilometer-an-hour speed limits. This is the point where sometimes I get shown the exit. Yes, thank you, Mr. Stonor, you can leave now. But we've got 4 more trends to go. Global trend number 3, designing for shade, soil, and rainwater. Let's go to, a holiday photograph. Why should we just enjoy the shade of trees when we're on our holidays? And look what's happening here. Okay, chap in shorts walking down the street, but look, next at that table, are they tourists? Are they business people? Are they a bit like, the younger people in that photograph I showed earlier? Are they doing business, transacting? Create the right conditions to lower the air temperature, and you can create those conditions for transaction that drive the future of our cities. So back to Paris. The plan to radically redesign the Champs-Élysées, and it's happening. Of course, we have the Olympics this year. It's going to be an accelerator, the Olympics, for the upgrading of the public realm of Paris. But it's already started low cost, relatively simple, unglamorous interventions. These are streets down by the River Seine in Paris. There's chalk on the ground. Maybe that was done by kids, maybe not. Maybe it's an artistic intervention. Low cost, happening. Start somewhere, get it done quick. The other place they started in Paris, the schools. So here's the CGI. For those of us who produce CGIs, this is a cheap one, but did the trick because, there's that happening right now. It's happening at the schools. Get the kids, get their parents and their carers used to the transformation of not being able to drive up to the front door of the school, throw the children out and drive away. And you've then got them. They're not going back. They're not going to take this stuff out. It's going to be permanent, and it will anchor the rest of the city's transformation. Wonderful to see. In my own practice, we can't design streets without designing shade. And in architecture and urban planning, we're just not good enough as professionals at this. There's so much more learning to be done. For me personally, and I know we have some landscape architects, you can't design a highway system or a street system or a mobility system, I should say, without landscape architects. Front and center of the process. Not just there to add the little touches that make it look nice in the photographs, but to actually drive the design. 3 types of shade, to put it simply, the shade of trees. Second type, shade of buildings. And the third type, if you need them, canopies. Gives us a very simple typology to present to clients. Combine them boldly in certain circumstances. This is a proposal for a new city in the Middle East. Radical shade, deep shade, multi-level shade, shade of trees, shade of canopy, shade of buildings. There's actually no private vehicles in this part of the city. There's a monorail network at high level, people on scooter, and out there is very hot. Those people aren't going to be there very long. They need to come into the deep shade. We didn't have nearly enough shade in this proposal, but the idea is every street is under shade in the city. Every street, including the local ones, and opportunities when you do so to use some of the indigenous visual and material features of the local architectural historic culture. So date palm trunks have been used for millennia to form the roofs of buildings, borrowing from that aesthetic to use them to support solar panels as well, and using stone and using mass earth constructions that can draw cool air at night and radiate it during the day. And sometimes our studio being invited to propose new mobility solutions to move from one part of the country to another, from one city to another. And the assumption was, I think, when they commissioned us, that we'd come back with a tram or a train or autonomous robotic vehicle or something, but we proposed an airship on the basis that if you don't have to touch the soil, the sand, the earth, then don't. Just float above it. And in fact, because of the nature of the topography, it's almost just as quick to fly than it is to drive in a 4x4. And if you want to try and level it and tarmac it, good luck, because it will come back at you, as they like to say, through the natural way in which landscapes fight back when you try to intervene too heavily with them. Global trend number 4. This is the space syntax lecture. So I'm going to get into that now. Global trend number 4, designing connected streets. Obvious in the way that cities had always been connected at low speed. Not just walkable, there were always carts or some sort of faster mobility, but generally under 30 kilometers, 20 miles, connected, multiply connected, continuously connected. Yes, there are plazas, piazzas, public spaces here, but not so big, because most climates are hot climates. I mean, London is a hot climate, believe it or not. And creating vast open space in London, we're just not doing it anymore, because we've learned the lesson that it bakes. So narrow, tight streets, continuously connected. We did forget that lesson, though, for this, while we were obsessed with Corbusier's Voisin automobile. I've said this is Skelmersdale. It could be anywhere. This is a post-war British new town. And on the face of it, you might say, well, it's green. It's a landscape urbanist solution. The green surrounds the fast highways that separate the communities living there. These communities have huge problems of loneliness, often among women, because traditionally the men have worked. The low-income families have one car. The man takes the car to work and leaves the woman at home on prescription medicines to deal with depression, loneliness. And this is the product of town planning that town planners don't like to or don't know to talk about, created by divisive, disconnected urbanism. So really, it's the integrated city of continuously connected neighborhoods and streets, promotes walking, it promotes cycling, it promotes livability. We need to move back to this kind of city and away from the fragmented city of disconnected developments. Destinations are found on streets on the left. If you want to go to the shop, it's on a street. On the right, you want to go to a shop, it's in a mall. So, and this typological difference is so pervasive within the industries that we have investment vehicles based on building the shopping mall. I do retail developers that just do retail, housing developers that just do housing, office park developers. I mean, office park, when it's called an office park, there's going to be no park. That just do that. And so we've commoditized urbanism. Integrated urbanism is more difficult to think about. Why have we done this? Well, it's simpler. Why have we done this? Well, it's the vision again, sorry. We're hooked on this, obsessed on this kind of aesthetic. And it's led by architects who've, I'm in my mid-50s, I'm 55 years old. I'm 56 years old next week. Thank you. I'm of an age that the people my age and older have had this education, and they're the people in charge right now. So kind of we need to either get them out of the way, educate them, or increase our own abilities to lead in order to make this change happen faster. An example of a scheme which pulls some of the ideas I've mentioned together. This is from Darwin in the Northern Territory, tropical climate, maybe with similarities to Singapore. If it isn't baking with heat, it's pouring with rain. And so the scheme in Darwin is there to create massive shade, walkable streets, and connected streets. Now, we can use technology to go a little bit further and help us to understand whether we've got the connections in the right place, whether we've got the land uses in the right place. And to do that, our approach at Space Syntax, as it says here, has been to make the invisible visible, which means to focus on space, focus on the space between buildings. Very difficult in a school of architecture to get anyone to think about anything but the buildings, but that's what was happening in the Bartlett at UCL in the 1980s. The group led by Bill Hillier and Julian Hansen radically said, no, we need to focus on the invisible stuff, and that will then help us to design the visible. So they drew it in black, and then they discovered through a process of trial and error, that the simplest, most effective description of space that they came across was to draw the fewest and longest lines of sight that pass through all of the street network of the city. So the main streets tend to have longer lines of sight that have more cross connections. The back streets, shorter lines of sight with fewer connections. This is now 50, getting on for 50 years old as a methodology. It's obvious to many of us, but at the time it was radical. Because what you could then do was take each of those lines as an element in an algorithm and say, give it a number, each line gets a number. This line connects to that line and that line and that line, but not that line and that line and that. And you could code it. So what this group was doing was, on the one hand, describing space, on the other hand, using primitive computation, run overnight, sent up to laboratories in Cambridge to churn away on a computer that was otherwise during the day doing nuclear experiments. And then there was another group that was studying people and counting them. And they were two different research groups. There was the computational people here, and then there was the observational people saying there's 100 people every hour walking on this street. And guess what? Every day between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, it's 100. Oh, it's 90 or 110, but it's kind of, an hour later, it's a bit more, and an hour later it peaks, and then it fades away. And it's the same every day. Human behavior is not chaotic and unpredictable. It's probabilistic. And then there was this sort of magic eureka moment where the computation group doing this geeky stuff and the sociology group doing their geeky stuff put acetate on top of acetate and said, those streets with most connections that are coming out of the algorithm as having this level of connectivity are the busiest. And the ones that have the least connectivity are the quietest. And 50 years later, it's totally obvious. But at the time, no one had ever seen it before or done it before. And this, in urban planning, of course, I would say it, but I think this is one of the most fundamental discoveries in science, in the science of urban planning. Pretty quickly then, through research efforts, 2 or 3 years later, the Macintosh computer had arrived, things went into color. We no longer needed to send stuff up the telephone line to Cambridge. We could do it on a desktop in London. And you could do experiments. So drop a pin on Oxford Circus and measure the distance from Oxford Circus in each direction, adding one more thing to the computation, not just distance, but angular change from the origin. So that as you move away and as you start twisting and turning, depth falls away faster. But if you move away along a more or less straight street, depth falls away slower. And this started to pick up these radial structures in cities. I'm going to show London, but I'll get us to Barcelona pretty quickly. This is the reach from Oxford Circus. Move a little bit further from Oxford Circus to a place called Islington, stand on Upper Street, do the same thing. It's not quite as hot. It's hot, but not quite as hot. Move to Canary Wharf, brand new development, office park in the middle of Docklands. It's much, much less. In fact, do it from everywhere to everywhere. And within this system, there may be 30, 40,000 individual street segments. measure the connectivity from each to all the others, you're very quickly into hundreds of millions, if not billions, of computational events. That's where computing comes in. So here we've just done it from everywhere to everywhere else. It takes about an hour to do, even today. And you can create this unique heat signature, urban centrality, to give it a technical term, for London. This is assuming everyone could move from everywhere to everywhere else, dial it down to say within 2 kilometers, just shorter journeys. And your eye may have caught the reduction in the central red spot from the previous slide, but just put your eye over to the right where I've put the dot. This is shorter 2 kilometer journeys. I'm going to go back to 10 kilometers. Here's a part of London that isn't that important for large scale journeys, but it is important for local journeys. Here's it's the first town out of London. So we've kept working and working and working to try to understand what's going on. And we can start to categorize urban centrality in terms of this fundamental relationship between large scale movement, call it global, and shorter scale movement, local. Why is that important? Well, that's what's happening on every street of every city in the world. You step out of your house onto it, and someone's coming to it from further afield. Your local interaction with the street is part of someone's global interaction with the street. This is the reality, and we're trying to capture it through mapping. But going to streets is not the only thing that happens on them. The other thing that happens on streets is people pass through them. People in going from Oxford Circus to Upper Street pass mostly along the red line between them there. Why? How can I be confident? Well, we've followed a lot of people, we've tracked a lot of people, we've looked at data on a lot of people, and what we've learned is most people, most of the time, take the direct route from origin to destination. Who's going to argue with me against that? The architects, because we like to wander into the back streets and sketch and write poetry. And well, yes, but you're the less than 1%. What most people do most of the time is take the simple journey from origin to destination. And as they do so, they share the route that they're taking with other people. So the people going from Oxford Circus to Canary Wharf, if I just wiggle these lines, the first part of the journey they share. Just to the east of Oxford Circus, there is shared with multiple overlapping journeys. People moving from Upper Street to Canary Wharf might share a little bit or none at all of the journey between Canary Wharf and Oxford Circus. So you can look at the through movement on any street as well. And when you do that with a computer that does everywhere to everywhere else, and what do they pass along on the simple journey from origin to destination? It picks out a different sort of color pattern to what we just saw. It picks out a foreground grid, to give you a bit of syntax tech jargon, a foreground grid of main routes in red, and a background grid of those quieter, cooler routes. Dial the journeys down to, say, a 2 kilometer radius, so walkable rather than drivable. And it's similar, but not quite the same. I'll go back 10 kilometer, forward 2. Some streets are important for 10 kilometer global and 2 kilometer local. Some are only important at 2 kilometers. Some are only important at 10 kilometers. That's the reality of journeys in cities. You've got different sorts of journeys happening, sometimes overlapping, and sometimes not. Now, first, fundamental discovery, as I mentioned earlier with the acetate, again and again and again, we find that these maps predict movement, whether that's pedestrian movement on the left at that kind of 2 kilometer radius, or vehicle movement on the right at that 10 kilometer radius. So space syntax models are a very simple, you might even say primitive form of transport modeling, using one variable, the spatial network, to predict 60, 70% of the vehicle movements. In the world, any transport engineers in the room or online, put your thumbs up. No, there never are. What are they? Oh yeah, sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. You are exceptional. To most transport modelers, this is impossible. You need 40 or 50 variables. You need to spend tens of millions of pounds and years collecting data to end up with a model that predicts at best 50% flows. One variable takes about an hour, and we've got 60 to 70% of the variables. Space syntax is yet to have its breakthrough moment in transport modeling, possibly because transport modeling wouldn't like the implications of it. I'll move quickly on. Key discovery number 2. You can ask me afterwards why transport modeling might not like the implications of a model that's quicker and cheaper. Key discovery number 2, that this route hierarchy influences land use viability. The shops are on the main streets. The shops are on those locations where most people naturally pass them. This is the lesson of 10,000 years of urbanism. Go to Pompeii, go to the archaeological sites of the world. The shops are on the main streets. It's so obvious. How come we did the opposite 100 years ago? What gave us the confidence to break 10,000 years of continuous evolution? Some kind of boldness, but I suggest not the best kind of boldness. So we have maps that express these relationships between, in this case, the streets that carry both global and local movement in red, the streets in London that carry local movement predominantly in the, if you can see it, the amber color. There's a thick gray line, which are the streets that carry mostly large-scale journeys, so the vehicle-dominated ones. In central London, there are barely any of them. That's the nature of the continuously connected grid. Right. I think this is the last bit of the syntax part before I get back to some case studies, but I did want to cover it because what you're about to see has never been shown anywhere in the world before, which is so impossibly obvious, I can't believe why not. But on the left, we have urban centrality. I could test you, but you'll remember that that's about how easy it is to get to places. And on the right, we have route hierarchy, which is how likely is it on this street people are passing through as they go to somewhere else. On the left, urban centrality, we know forecasts the kind of density and height of buildings. You find bigger buildings in the center of cities. We also know it forecasts land value. I'll say a bit more of that in a moment. On the right, route hierarchy, we know forecasts movement flows. So just put the two together. And we've created something called the Main Streets Index. Now, what this is attempting to do is to categorize each street type according to those very central, very busy streets in the top of the table here, the deepest of purple lines, which become less dense as you move towards the central edge of the city, and less dense as you move to the outer edge, but still important. Even those blue streets at the edge are the local high street. They're the place that you might have a 7-Eleven. You might have a few local cafes, but you're not going to have tall buildings and you're not going to have continuous retail. You might just have a short stretch. And this becomes really important because this is how cities are. This is how Barcelona is. And we've started doing this a couple of weeks ago, and it's describing beautifully how the patterns of land value and density and movement are categorically different between the center and the edge, but the edge is still important. That's still where people live. That's still places that can sustain jobs. Not as many as the center, but still some. Why is this all important? Because we're going to get to pretty quickly, we'll need to, AI. Because if we can understand how cities are, we can train AI to design them how they could be, and possibly you might even say should be. We can maybe discuss why we can't trust architects and urban planners to do that. Maybe because there's too many over 55-year-olds in the room. Notable exceptions for anyone who might be over 55, and I wouldn't dare to judge your age. What else do we know? Let me just cover a couple of things. Obesity. Health practitioner colleagues with access to medical records that we don't have, but access to our data that we've shared with them, show us the correlations between physical health outcomes like obesity, which is probably, now that we've got rid of for now anyway, the coronavirus, this is the global pandemic to really worry about, along with social isolation and loneliness as the other. Again, the data showing the more we look, the more we see, the more we find. And the people who really understand space are not in this room, I don't think. They're the criminals. Criminals really understand space. Architects think we understand. I'm only going to bash architects because I'm an architect. Although I haven't bashed landscape designers, but a lot of time for them. Burglary in white, I'm making light of a very serious situation, but house damage, property theft in greater levels in those spatially segregated parts of cities that have been designed in the 20th century as enclaves. We thought we were creating communities, we were creating crime. In contrast, another way of looking at this, property values. So on the left, a disconnected plan of poorly accessed streets versus a connected alternative. Same site, two plans, two designers. There's who's good with their conversion, 400 million US dollars of difference between the plan on the left and the plan on the right. Same amount of real estate put together differently. You know, if you mix flour and water and a couple of other ingredients, you either have a cake or you have glue. It's just the same with space. There's a lot of money being lost if it's not connected properly. So in practice, we have a design tool. As an 19-year-old, when I first came across space syntax, what I loved most was that I could use it to test designs. Are they going to work or not? No. Go back to the drawing board, try another design. Link it from edge to center. Good principle of urban planning. Don't hide in, link from edge to center. And you can create not just the hot red streets that you can line with shops, but also some slightly quieter ones where you can have greater levels of peace and tranquility. You want to have a color mix, a spatial mix. And these are the sorts of principles that, as we developed the plans for Trafalgar Square, were put into practice to prove that those stairs were in the forecast going to generate hot red lines of movement down them that gave us the confidence and gave decision makers the confidence to build, to finance. Slopes can be coded, the degree of slope. Of course, no one likes walking up a slope. You might like cycling down a slope, but no one likes cycling up a slope. So you can weight the 2D plan with a 3D. And if anyone knows their Grand Prix history, they know which city that I'm contractually not able to mention. I'm showing you the model of, I think, Marina. Buildings are very largely predictable in terms of footfall, whether it's an art gallery here, modeled on the left using visibility modeling, similar to what I've shown you for cities. And on the right, where we followed 100 people from the entrance for 10 minutes, check the legality, but I highly recommend it to follow someone for 10 minutes through a public space in a way that is unobtrusive. You learn a lot about human behavior by observing real people. A very close correlation between the two. Staircases and escalators and lifts are all modelable. I have to say that because it's the question that so often gets asked. Key use, the dignified reconnection of unplanned and informal settlements at the edges of cities, squatter settlements that have been made by people, which often work very, very well as walkable environments, but are disconnected from the wider city by fast highways. So a lot of our work in the Space Intact Studio has been to produce plans that irrigate the walkable center of these places with connections to the outsides, and far too many examples for me to show. I'm going to move through the global trend number 5 pretty quickly, designing mixed use and walkability, because I think I've covered most of these points. That you don't want to have an enclave, a separation, a zoning. You want to have a mix. You want to be able to have jobs near where you work. Why, who invented the commute? Don't tempt me. It'll go back to Corbusier, maybe Frank Lloyd Wright. A commute on foot for a few minutes, very nice. Chance to say hello to the neighbors. A street that mixes walking, driving on the extreme left and right of this image, working, galleries, residences shaded by trees. And within the data modeling field, we're trying to track all of this through a process we're calling integrated urban modeling, taking different data feeds on the spatial connectivity, the land use attraction, on the transport infrastructure, and learning how to mix them and balance them to address those economic, environmental, public health, social challenges on the right. Building tools that either work at the level of the individual street or of the entire country. In this case, a national modeling system, the Walkability Index of the UK, allowing us to zoom in on individual cities, compare one housing developer on the left, who happens to be the King of England, with another housing developer on the right, who will never be King of England. The one on the left, Poundbury, being more walkable because it's more connected and because it mixes land uses, where there is at least one job for every one residential place. Radical, bringing it down to street level so that this mix occurs in the street sections of a kind that I showed earlier, working with landscape designers to make sure that you can sit on the street and sit and watch the world go by. So often we're told, no, streets are noisy, busy, dirty places, only because we've made them or thought that they are. But if we say, well, actually, they're full of the urban buzz and they're full of money for the real estate industry, and we know how to deliver them, and we know how to be bold and ambitious by proposing public transport because we're going to get the land value uplift to build it and to continue to maintain it. Then we can use modeling to create these approaches that allow us to code, to measure, to monitor, to be able to test different options, and to help me to close, to train the AI, the spatial DNA of cities helping us to train AI. So I think you can't really have a conversation without mentioning AI these days. It's my last global trend, generative AI. How can you use AI? Wonderful things, type space opera theater and you get this incredible portrait of an unbelievable environment. Well, how can we as urban planners, designers of any kind, use data to drive the urban planning and design process? So we're experimenting. Part of what we do at Space Intact is to just experiment, enter competitions, as we did here, built a tool that first of all counted the negative factors like the noise of the motorway, the landing, takeoff cone from the airport, to be able to identify where land is at risk of flood, to be able to say where the precious trees and landscapes are that we don't want to damage as we develop the city, to put it all together to create sensitivity parameters, and then identify the gateways as little red dots into the existing city and release the agents. And the agents have within them encoded information on linearity, street hierarchy, route centrality, land use mix, slow speed, width, height, density, all those features that I've mentioned in the case studies, to grow the street network of the city in a way that defines the primary street network, to then be able to zoom in on neighborhoods and design the secondary street network, to optimize it with algorithms, to zoom even further in with different land uses on local housing areas, and to settle, and at the moment it's a matter of judgment, maybe the AI will eventually take over the judgment, but to settle on a plan that identifies the mixed-use boulevards, identifies the residential streets, identifies the garden villas, puts it all together as a plan that allows us to link it back to the existing city with public transport, and then to render it in 3 dimensions. And this is not just to replace the foolish architect, the arrogant architect, the misguided urban planner. This is to bring sensible urban planning, bold, compassionate, data-driven, to communities that have no access to those designers. The urbanizing parts of the world, the places that are going to change most quickly for better or for worse, are those parts of the world where the professions of architecture, urban planning, and landscape design barely exist. So if we can serve local leadership groups, maybe the village leadership with a tablet and a satellite link, using satellite data that's analyzing soil and topography and water catchment, and can show where to build the warehouse, where to build the bridge, even more elaborate systems that might show how to redevelop an old industrial land, as you're looking at here. We can fast track the delivery of sustainable communities. I'm going to pause at this point. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir, for that inspiring lecture. I would now like to invite on stage Mr. Stonor, as well as the moderator for the evening, Ms. Genevieve Sean. Genevieve graduated with an MArch from SCI-Arc, South California Institute of Architecture, after which she trained in several places, including Kengokuma in Tokyo and Atkins in Hong Kong. She then decided to switch things up by taking up a master's in spatial analytics at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, and later on embarking on a PhD in architecture and spatial computation. It was during this period when she started working at the Space Syntax London office. At the start of the pandemic, she returned to Singapore and worked as a researcher for the Center for Livable Cities, where she was involved in urban planning, analytics, and research management in complexity. She's currently teaching at NUS cities, SUTD, NE, and Polytechnic on a wide range of subjects from urban strategy, data analytics, architecture to product design. Please join me in welcoming her on stage. We shall now be taking questions from the audience as well as on Zoom as well. So please raise your hands and we'll run around with the mics. Thank you. It should.
We'll do a quick mic test to see if it's working or not. 1, 2.
Hello. Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. That was I learned a lot actually watching your lecture. So I had the privilege of working with Tim as my boss, first as an intern at Space Syntax, and then when I was doing my PhD, I was also working as a part-time consultant in the office. So yeah, thank you, Tim. And I would like to encourage everyone in the room. I know there are many students as well and people from different domains, not in architecture and planning, to ask questions that are intuitive to you without, caring if they sound smart. Yeah. Oh, so many. Okay, let's start with, let's start Anjana.
Thanks for a great presentation. Hi, thank you for a great presentation. I'm an architect and urban designer, unfortunately. No, but I'm just joking aside. I'm currently doing my PhD and I'm also working on spatial network analysis. So my question is a two-parter. So the first one, I saw some of your case studies in informal settlements, right? I wanted to just ask, beyond the intuitive insights, were there any surprising insights from studying like space syntax methods in informal settlements? And second thing was, it was really interesting to see your insight in generative AI. And I wanted to know, like, is there room for some sort of informal in that formal framework that you come up with using AI methods? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot in both questions. On the subject of unplanned settlements, I only showed 2 slides, and it deserves a lot further explanation. The big challenges are, on the one hand, who decides? If I sort of put the syntax to one side for a moment, I think my experience is who gets to decide. And secondly, the challenges of integrating everyday services within the spatial structures of unplanned settlements. In terms of who decides, I've had various experiences, for better or for worse, working with local communities who are local experts and really understand their place has been fascinating. So I can think of a really positive. I'm there now with a fishing community who understood the challenges of where they were living, and who had some strong say in which of the proposals that they preferred, versus the top-down, we're doing it to you challenge. The second kind of challenge is, how do you let people stay living where they are when you're making so much change to what's around them, which tends to be why the preference for strong governance is often just to move people on, demolish, rebuild. And I'm thinking of a negative situation right now, where, having produced a lot of the plans you've just seen, working with engineers who worked out how we could tunnel to introduce energy supply and waste removal, and then having worked out an economic set of options whereby you could either give local people a little bit of money to upgrade themselves, so a kind of granular process, or you could work with a development company who would compensate people in other ways, but be able to bring in bigger development, bigger machinery, frankly. All of that was worked out, and yet in the end, the strong decision was made to actually move people on and replace rather than evolve those neighborhoods. So yeah, a subject for a longer discussion, I think.
Yeah, and my second part was like, do you see that in
the
AI?
Yeah, sorry, I was too traumatized by my second negative experience there. Yes, I mean, there has to be, doesn't there, serendipity? Serendipity is part of the reality of cities anyway. Things happen that you could never have predicted. And so to be able, there's no one solution to anything. And I think what we are seeing with AI is that it gives you multiple options. It can give you multiple options very quickly if you design which parameters are worth changing. But there are some, like the foreground grid of a city, the main street structure, that kind of, there's often a very small subset of options around that. So often when we're coding and saying, well, what is it that you need to establish? We start with the foreground grid, because that's often following the lines of topography. It's often governed by sensitivities around soil quality and others. The secondary street network, the way residential space is laid out, there's a lot more variability in that. And then, yeah, you want to kind of throw in the kind of bonus chance. What if this? I don't think we know enough yet, frankly, about what is possible with the AI. We've been using analytic AI at Space Syntax for about 20 years. My statistician colleagues tell me, multivariate regression analysis is a primitive form of AI. Generative AI, though, is about the last 6 years. And not every client can afford it or even knows they want it. So it's very few exceptions, very few projects that we've worked on so far, but we're not going to switch off from it because I think because of those opportunities to serve so many people so quickly. I'd rather give people one firm idea of what they can do than multiple options. If I can give more people that one idea than just a few people multiple options, I think I would reduce the randomness in it, remove the serendipity, and that might be seen as somehow negative, but if you can do more faster that way, that might be the right balance.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for the wonderful talk. And I am an architect and urban designer, unfortunately, as well. And
I'm never going to live this down, am I? I'm joking.
yes, definitely.
I don't think you're over 55.
Yeah. So my question, you talked about the human interactions in the beginning and how do you bring to the eye level of human experience. And in the end, when you show the project, like starting from the noise pollution, the flooding, the whole methodology framework is a very typical urban design project. That's what we've been doing in studios, like in real projects. So I'm curious about how you think is the way to bridge that, because the second framework is constantly from a top-down perspective. You're always looking at the plan. Do you think the way to bridge those two is to bring more tools, to bring more spatial analytic tools, or is it to reflect on the existing urban design methodology framework?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it seems on the face of it, there is a paradox in saying, look at the world from eye level, but draw it as if you're flying over the top of it in a helicopter. I don't think the two are incompatible. I think drawing plans is, it's not the only thing that we do. We do the eye level CGI, we do the street section, but a plan is a heck of a convenient way of expressing an idea. And you can't, it's the most effective means of describing the land use distribution and spatial connectivity pattern of a city that we've come across. So we'd do it differently if we thought that there was a better way. You just don't do it alone. And more importantly than any of that, what's driving the top-down connectedness of our approach is that basic starting point of observing what people do on streets and getting to understand their patterns of movement and interaction. So it may seem like a paradox, but I'm quite comfortable with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else from the audience?
Hi, from all the case studies that show, they are quite two-dimensional in nature for space syntax studies, but in cities that are three-dimensional, since we have like underground links, sky bridges. How do you think space syntax or analysis of urban spaces would react to this like three-dimensional structures?
Yeah,
because now we walk all over the place.
I tried to avoid this question by saying that I always get this question, but I'm thank you for continuing my track record of always getting this question. Reality is 3D. Reality is 3D. And for much, but not all of the world, it's multi-level. There is a substantial part of our planet where almost everything happens at ground level. Most buildings are 1 story tall. I mean, I'd love to know, and I just don't, but I think most buildings in the world are 1 story, possibly with a ladder to a roof or a stair to a roof. So we don't need to go multi-level if we want to address the needs of most people on the planet. However, when you do, gravity isn't your friend in architecture. And I'm fascinated by multi-level environments. If you can treat architecture, put all of the social just to one side for the moment, the aesthetic of a multi-level environment, I love it. I think it's inspirational to look up or down. I was in a 7-8 story retail mall recently, maybe not the kind of building I would ever want to design, but it was fantastic seeing people move up the escalation and move across levels. We've been modeling multi-level environments in space syntax for as long as I can remember. We just model the staircase as a link, model the elevator as a link, weight them. So there's all sorts of techniques and tricks. I showed an environment where we've weighted slope in order to be able to simulate that effect that the really steep historic part of town is less busy than the flatter part. And in an architecture, I'll come back to where I started. I mean, I think architects should always be thinking in 3D. So even though you draw the plan, you're thinking in 3D. If you really know what you're doing, you're thinking in the section, you're drawing the section, you're drawing the view up, the view down. We're never very far away from it, even when we draw a 2D plan.
Thank you. Anyone else from the audience? And then we can take a question or two from the Zoom call as well.
Hi, I'm Maria. Okay, I was a student I'm doing master in space syntax, and then I just graduated last year. And then I was thinking that I want to further in the space syntax itself. Then I was thinking, space syntax will reflect to the urban features on the road? I can understand is the space syntax, they have the ISO-Vs, spatial visibility or something like that, right? So I want to understand, I want to know better if the AI generated can have urban features also.
And just help me here. And what do you define as an urban feature?
Okay, maybe based on my study, urban features have the street fences, the digital urban screen, flower boxes, and then the fences, the bench also, right?
Yeah.
So this is based on my previous supervisor. She did the space syntax based on the static activities.
Yeah.
And then I want to know whether the generated AI can be done based on the urban features.
So we don't have yet experience of taking generative AI to that level of detail, but we do have experience of coding, architectural urban design coding for streets to be able to say, I mean, if you go with very kind of, I don't want to use the word basic because there isn't really anything basic about space syntax. It's very clever stuff. But if you go with a basic colored line that says this is a hot red line, it's a bit like drawing a plan in 2D. There's so much information in just the hot redness that this has the potential to be the main street of the city. If it's the main street of the city, you would expect there to be a mix of mobility. So you'd expect there to be some maybe some private vehicles, unless you're being radical like we were in that example I showed and removed them. You'd expect there to be public transport. You'd expect there to be retail, shopping. Therefore, you'd expect there to be some protection against rain and sun. And then if people are going to be walking there, you'd expect there to be the opportunity to sit down. You might expect there to be more trees. So you can code. Now, we just haven't done it yet, but why can't you also say to the AI, train it with all of that information, and then it'll elevate a 3D version of what you've coded?
Okay, because I was thinking, right, because based on the technology nowadays, we have the digital urban screen, which is been done on your Professor Laura. So I was thinking space syntax maybe can relate to the urban features on the building, on the pedestrian walkway, and then it's a part of how to have more pedestrian to go to spend more time on the pedestrian walkway.
I'd need to understand what kind of pedestrian walkway you mean.
In my research, I discover the digital urban screen. Maybe people don't know the digital urban screen, that the TV by the road, we call the digital urban screen. They have a lot at the pedestrian walkway and then the road, something like that, right? So I hope that with the space syntax, we can have the, how to say, we have a regulation on the authority. We cannot put the digital over screen on the road, because I have a lot of the complaint feedback that the digital over screen too bright on the road and that it hurt the eyes or something like that. And then with the space syntax, this kind of the study, we can have that kind of, it shouldn't be we put anywhere anything. So this kind of the space syntax, I hope that we have the urban features on the app itself, can help the authority how to regulate based on digital urban screen.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know enough about digital urban screens to be able to properly address your question. But what I can say is that it sounds like this is about making decisions.
Yes.
And I think where I've seen the benefit of an analytic, data-driven approach is that it gives confidence to decision takers who otherwise have to believe what they're being told. And I think this is one of the reasons why in architecture we're trained so hard to be performers. We have to persuade people constantly. And we have to have an ego, and we have to have a vision, and we have to be able to sell it. What this kind of approach does is it puts numbers in the room as well. It puts numbers and graphs. And I mean, one of the cases I showed, I won't say where it is, but we were working for the mayor of the city and the president of the country. The mayor in particular liked a particular kind of graph. Not dots, not numbers, but a particular kind of graph. We learned this by spending time with them. So we were able to express our work, not just in terms of plans or elevations or sections, but graphs. So I think this is about saying, if you've got good evidence, good principles, and you're achieving the right goals, then a data-driven approach can be an incredibly helpful tool for decision makers.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
To be fair, maybe we'll take a question on Zoom.
Yeah.
So we keep them so they don't disconnect. So we have a question from Quinton Sim. Hi, Tim. Loved your lecture. I have used space and text for many basic analysis for master plan interventions for walkability. Now, can you elaborate? I think deleted the question. But he was.
Can I elaborate?
He asked
Happily.
if you can elaborate why transport engineers are not keen on space and text.
Oh,
or
because
modeling.
I was making a simple and trivial trite joke at the expense of another profession. But there is something in, if we speak seriously, cities have been planned by traffic engineers for too long. And in so many cities, and I'll be very cautious. I'm not talking about Singapore here. I'm not. Cities, I understand the person you need to talk to is usually a bloke. He usually wears a grey suit, and he's usually got a model. And he's called the head of transport department. And that's all fine. What you show Mr. Stonor is all lovely, but it's his decision. And it's not the mayor's, or it's his decision, because if the transport model says no, it's not going to happen. So why have we allowed our cities to be run by, if we had the right kind of transport modeling, let's call it mobility modeling, or let's call it, there we are, sir, you're the mobility modeler in the room. Or if you were, I'm saying you, I don't mean to tarnish you with your profession's crimes, and but if you had an integrated urban model that was talking about the risks of obesity and loneliness, as well as queuing distances and junction capacity, and if we've got what we've got because we've had numbers. Back to the point about numbers, the numbers in the room have been from the transport model. No one else has had numbers. Maybe the real estate people have had numbers. They go off and build their skyscrapers. Transport industry has numbers. It goes and builds its elevated roads and tunnels that disrupt embodied carbon and damage the lungs of unborn children. All of these things. the urban designers and landscape designers have not had numbers. Had they, then they could have brought those numbers to the conversation, and we, I think, might have had a different set of solutions. The health practitioners haven't been in the room. You know, where are the doctors? Hands up, all the doctors in the room. One. It was a leading question. We've got one medical professional in a room where get it wrong and our actions will damage the health of people, mental and physical. So there's an integrated urbanism that is much needed. So I'm going to try and stop looking at you because it's unfair.
Okay, well, I'll take
But
one
thanks
more.
for the question online.
Yeah, so one more question online before we go to Suthier. So Amelia Mosin said, you spoke about AI generating the best urban planning solution when AI itself does not carry compassion like humans do. So how do you rationalize this, and where does the compassion come in?
Yeah, well, I don't think an AI can have compassion, but you can code compassion. You can encode it. If we think from evidence, if we can see that a slow speed, mixed mobility environment, which is shaded, where the air temperature is cooler than it would be, that creates opportunities for people to transact. If we think that that's more compassionate than a fast highway severing a community, putting PM 2.5s in the air, and so that's what I mean. And I chose the word compassionate, and I'm pleased I did, because it's obviously provoked something. You can code for compassion, but that's not the same, quite rightly, as the questioner says. The AI isn't compassionate, but the code can be compassionate.
Okay, thanks, Tim. We have another question at the back. So was it Suthier? And then you behind Suthier. Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a question regarding the space syntax supported urban design. And our world is a very dynamic world, and the space syntax is a static description of the integration or choice status of urban network environment. A key part of urban design is traffic flow design. If we need for example, if we need a highly integrated space such as a business center, a highly integrated design seems to mean more traffic jam. What do you think about this? Should dynamic flow also be considered as part of space syntax supported urban design?
Yeah, so there was something there where there was an assumption that a more central development would create a bigger traffic jam. Why? Why should it? It doesn't have to. It will if you assume everyone travels to work by car, or most people, or many people. But if you give people the option of public transport, and if you give people the option of living closer to where they work, it's not an office park anymore or office center. It's a place. It's a place. It's a neighborhood. It's a district. And I think that having once in my life for 5 years lived at the very heart of London, Oxford Circus. If anyone's familiar with London, it's kind of as busy as, nearly as busy as London gets, sort of 10,000, 12,000 people an hour at Oxford Circus. A few more in Covent Garden. At the same time, that was the most tranquil environment just one street away. So this is about color mix. You can have the hot red, but just around the corner where we used to live, it was relatively green-blue. And that's the magic of cities. And there were lots of people working. It was an office center, but there were a few people living, and well, a lot of people living, actually. That's the kind of urbanism which avoids traffic jams. I think we've become so sort of wedded to the idea that if something is busier, then we need to have more road. I think if something's busier, we need to have more benches, would be the way I would think about it. We need more trees. And that's sort of bold, but kind of obvious thinking to set against the assumption that was in your question. But thanks for the question. And whenever anyone reads a question from a phone, I always worry because they thought about it a lot. a lot. It was a good one.
That's true. That's true.
Okay, thanks, Sujie.
Thank you. Thank you
The
so much.
person behind.
So sorry. So when you were going through like the different cities and kind of showing the transformation from like 1990 to now, one of the things I was thinking about is like the new development of like Saudi Arabia's The Line and how they are incorporating a lot of sort of like the aspects that you talked about in terms of the social trends or the global trends. And I was just curious, like what your take is on it from like an architectural perspective.
It's a project I've decided not to make any comments in public about.
Thank you.
I spend a lot of my working life in the region, in the kingdom, and it's not a project I've got experience of.
Okay.
Okay.
Take the microphone so we can hear you on Zoom.
Hi, so I got two questions going on. And firstly, I come from an AI background. So basically what we are now training like AI is from big data. Like I have a feeling that after getting the AI, generated AI down, it's more like an average source from like a bunch of data. So basically there are good and bad data. How do you determine which data is good, which data is bad in urban planning?
That's a really, really important question. Because bad data in, bad generative AI out would be, I guess, the summary. By studying historic cities, by studying contemporary cities and the way that they've grown, by studying a lot of unplanned settlements, the question earlier about unplanned settlements, how one of the most positive learnings from unplanned settlements is how innately walkable, how unplanned settlements look a lot like cities that have been around for thousands of years. And why should that be? I think it's something about when you leave people in great need to their own devices to decide for themselves how they choose to live, you get a particular morphology of space, a particular allocation of land uses. I think it's because the professions haven't been all over them to tell them how they should live. The unplanned settlements, people have worked it out. There's a lot to learn from that. So we study historic cities. We study cities from the archaeological record. A lot of work in space syntax is done by archaeologists because they're uncovering spatial layouts, streets and buildings, and they're trying to work out what might have happened in them. And they know from what they're finding of the kinds of uses that those buildings had. And some of these cities have survived for a long time. So there's a lot to learn from them. That gives us the good data.
And second question is like, since currently the AI only generate more like an average level, so should the like urban planning education be more like forecast, more like out-box thinking and more like futuristic to think something really future, like not?
Why should we? I mean, one of the problems in the creative industries is that we think we have to do something that's never been done before. And actually with urbanism, and there are lots of good reasons in technology and engineering, product design, product development, we should be trying to improve the performance of an engine, the performance of the part in a machine. Of course we should. In urbanism, we've had 100 years of experimentation, and it's led to huge social damage. So at least for the next 100, if not the next 10,000, I think we should copy the principles of places. Now, what makes the uniqueness of a city is its landscape, its climate, its soil, its wind, its rain, its slope, the local materials, the stone, the sound of the birds. They're different in different places. I think if architecture could be a bit more humble, a kind of architecture of humility, to recognize this. And I don't know whether, Doctor, it's something that we learn from medicine. You know, you don't treat every patient as if they're the same and you can just do what you want because it's another one. It's another man, another one. Every landscape is different. So we need to understand and respond to. So that's the difference. But the similarity is streets, public spaces, denser in the middle, more permeable in the center, radial connections from center to edge. I lost track of time earlier, so I missed my closing slides, which we're going to share, aren't we? But no, let's not do it now because I'll be tempted to bang on for another 10 minutes. There are principles that we can apply. The theory of natural movement, the theory of pervasive centrality, the theory of the foreground grid. These are all consistencies. And then apply them to the uniqueness of the environment that you're working in. But you know, architecture school is full of people trying to do things that have never been seen before. It's the wrong training. We need to be humble.
Thank you. So
Thanks.
I guess it's my turn now. I've been waiting. So
The killer question.
So I have two questions. One is more serious and one is more fun. And I'm going to pretend to read from my phone, Tim. So it looks like I thought about it. So Singapore, we are a smart nation. And I mean, from what I've seen, Singapore is very technology forward and always ready for technology, for city planning. So we have all the instruments ready, systems ready, software ready, whether it be sensors, LiDAR scanning, digital twins, drones, mobile phone tracking, drones. I mean, the list goes on. These tools are usually meant, for the most part, optimization, flaw detection, data collection. We've seen every kinds of this in conferences as well. How can we go? I mean, how can we make the shift to go beyond optimization, to think before optimization, so we can, go on an approach where it's towards more a humane city and a more sensational, I love that word, a sensational city.
Yeah, and it's not just Singapore where smart city technologies are being deployed to optimize in the way that you've just described, but it is the smart nation. Okay, I think there's two sides to this. Was this the fun question or this is the serious one? Okay. The two sides to me are all of the tech is helpful, but fundamentally, I come to Singapore because it's a people place. I enjoy meeting people in Singapore, the kind of outlook, the ambition, that's what really appeals to me. I don't come here for the tech. So it's always what I'm trying to say is it's useful, but it's only ever a support mechanism. And then the second side of it is so much of the tech, almost all of it, is about the operation and maintenance of places. So if you think of a timeline that begins with, let's say, policy, like where I started, policy gets written, someone has a vision, they create a plan. Within the plan, there's then architecture, detailed design, urban landscape design. Then it gets constructed. And after it's constructed, it's operated and maintained. That is a kind of simplistic timeline. Policy, vision, plan, design, construct, operate, manage, maintain. Most of the smart cities industry is at the end of the timeline. It's focused on operations and maintenance. And in our own, it's a small way, but in our own small way at Space Syntax, we're trying to pull technology earlier in time towards the creation of policy, definitely towards the creation of plans, and into then architecture. I didn't show much because it was cities, the subject today, but our work inside buildings is nearly half of what we do. So I could be showing you lots of hospitals and museums that we've been involved in, workplaces. That's the gap. The gap right now is the planning and design of buildings. The construction of them, we've got, you know, construction drones and material science and all sorts of fantastic stuff going on. You just got to draw it. So if there are technologists in the room, the opportunity is to bring not just AI, but other forms of technologies earlier in the process.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, I mean, the last question, I'll give the, but I want to ask the fun question. Or do you want to go? Oh, no, you go.
Hi, my name is Giovanna. I'm an exchange student. I'm studying architecture at UC Berkeley. And I just wanted to ask, what role do you think generative AI is going to play into the 15-minute city concept? And do you believe that that is the future in the sustainable communities you were just now talking about?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for mentioning the 15-minute city, because it's sort of woven into everything else that I've said this evening, apart from those words. The idea that you can get to whatever you need to get to within 15 minutes, whether that's a 15-minute walk or 15 minutes on public transport, which gets you a bit further. So it's a big part of urban planning, and it's such a, I mean, I love the concept because it's crystallized something in a way that everyone understands. They all disagree. And Carlos Moreno, I think, who created the concept, working with Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, he said, it doesn't really matter if it's 10 minutes or 20 minutes, you know, everyone's talking about it. He said, it's not 15, it's about localism. So extremely useful as a concept. And I think that's what we've lost, you know, the commuting city, the city of an hour in a private vehicle doing nothing other than getting angry, is the opposite. So I think it's a really useful concept. And sorry, was there another part to your question that I missed?
What role is generative AI?
Generative AI, yeah. Well, look, if I have great hope. I have great hope for the future. But if the people in power at the moment, in design power, are not delivering the 15-minute city, then let the robots, or, you know, let the AI do it, because we've got urgent challenges of climate mitigation, and we've got health pandemics. We've got the big challenge of dignified shelter. We need to build 96,000 housing units per day globally to address housing shortage. And, you know, if that could be assisted with generative AI by producing plans faster, getting them approved faster, then I'm not worried about the professions being angry. The profession should be enabling rather than hindering.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joshua, and I am fortunately not an architect. I get. I'm joking. Sorry. I also work in sort of like data support, like data-driven planning support tools. And I wanted to ask, you've alluded in the past to the faults of individual human judgment, especially by professionals who impose perspectives formed without evidence. And to be honest, I'm inclined to agree. But towards the end, you talked about, like, what caught my eye was you talked about bringing better planning to growing cities and regions. And you proposed, like, for example, conserving local leadership structures in these places while also allowing the AI to tell these leaders where to build warehouses and where to build other things. Admittedly, my uninformed gut reaction was to wonder how the normative effect of generative AI could affect the agency of these communities and local leaders, to what extent the judgment belongs to communities, to what extent it's informed by AI, and to what extent that's a good thing. But to be fair, the status quo of planning in these regions clearly does not ensure the agency in any better way. But to get to the point, I wanted to ask your thoughts on how these data-driven tools, AI or not, could be designed in a way to provide that decision support while addressing the perception of being prescriptive, and also to allow that social and cultural responsiveness we've talked about in the past. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what's so nice about your question and the other questions this evening is they really make me think. I'm working hard here to articulate responses, because you're I think getting to the heart of issues of morality and ethics. Opening a book of guidance is a moral and ethical action. Do I take the guidance? Listening to the advice of an advisor is a moral and ethical moment for any leader. And why should AI be any different? So I think that's my first sort of inarticulate thought. Second is, we need to talk about this stuff. We need to have the conversation in an ongoing way, continuously. And the ethics of technology should be in the room with the technology and the experts on ethics. And then a third, just to there's something about common sense that I think people know when they're being sold something that's not right. I could be wrong, but I just have this feeling that if you can code the compassionate city, that's what we should be aiming for. I think that goes down. My company began advising community groups in London that were being sold the wrong product by property developers. And the community came to University College London and they said, look, we need help, because these people are going to demolish our community, build something, separate us from our neighbors. We don't think it's right, but we're being told it's right. We're being told we'll be richer and everything will be fine. We just don't believe it. So I think if you can harness that innate human common sense and understand that people sort of have a good feel for what they need and give them what they feel they need, then that would be the track that I would try to take. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we're running out of time. So I'll just end on with an easy question, Tim, the fun, easy question. Which is, you've been in Singapore. Let's have a Singapore-based question, since we're all here. You've been in Singapore many, many times, and you would always stay in the same hotel at Orchard Road, just right at the tip, a very, very nice and fancy hotel, but the same one at the edge of Orchard Road and Tanglin Mall. But recently, I think I've convinced you to move to a new hotel that is in the Duxton area, which is where you're staying tonight. Maybe you wanted to describe to us your change in mobility and describe to us spatial patterns you see between these two places.
Gosh, well, we need thank you, Jen. We need a spatial model of Singapore that I can move around. And so I'm not going to answer your question, because that's what I am going to say is that we can build this model. You've built it, right? So you should be able to answer your question about Orchard Road, higher levels of global through movement and global centrality. Global through movement, lower levels of global centrality. Duxton, high levels of global and local centrality, a real potential place, highly walkable because of the levels of mixed land uses there. So I wish we had the model. Let's build the model. Let's have these conversations driven by data. And I like them both. You know, I think that's the great thing about cities is that they give you choice, that they give you more than one kind of experience. And who knows where I'll stay next time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Is there anything you want to? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone in this audience as well as on Zoom for raising such interesting and important questions. We would like to thank Mr. Stonor for giving his valuable time for such an inspiring and beautiful lecture. We'd also like to thank Ms. Genevieve for her time as well as her moderation for the session. I think we've learned a lot from the session. I'm really sorry, in the interest of time, we have a lot of unanswered questions. We will try our best to coordinate, but just because we've been getting a lot of requests, this whole lecture has been recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So you can always review them whenever you want. Yeah. Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for attending this event and actively participating with your questions. We are very pleased to inform you about our next lecture on 21st of Feb by Dr. Jonathan Reichenberg. He's the founder of Human Future and also the past Chief Information Officer for the City of Palo Alto. Do register for the same at the earliest since there are limited seats at the STE3 auditorium. Please watch out for our social media channels as well as your emails where we will be informing you about our future lectures. Thank you and hope you have a very nice evening.